For nearly 700 years, the most valuable economic asset in the ancient Mediterranean was a plant. Not gold, not silver, not grain or olive oil, or any of the commodities we associate with classical wealth. A plant. It was known by the name Silphium, and it grew in only one place on Earth, a narrow strip of coastline in what is now eastern Libya. It treated fevers, infections, digestive ailments, chronic pain, and a list of other conditions so long that ancient writers struggled to catalogue them all. The Greek colony of Cyrene, built around its trade, became one of the wealthiest cities in the Mediterranean. The plant itself was minted onto coins, carved into temples and praised by every major medical authority of the classical world. And then it was gone, within a generation, completely, with no surviving cultivated specimens and no preserved seeds. The official explanation is overgrazing, but stay with us, and we will find out why that might not be the whole story, and why there may be a much more sinister reason behind its disappearance. Now, as always, I need to state that there are hard facts in this story, and there are speculations made from those facts. The disappearance of Silphium is genuine. The historical record on what the plant did, how widely it was traded, and how completely it vanished is well documented. What is more interpretive is the question of why it disappeared so totally, and why no one in the ancient world managed to preserve it. The standard answer is overgrazing and habitat collapse. The alternative answers are more provocative, and the evidence for them is suggestive rather than conclusive. And if my previous investigations are anything to go by, then it's safe to say that the standard explanation is rarely to be trusted. More often than not, we must dig a little deeper to discover who is feeding us that information and what they stand to gain from it. Let us start with the plant itself. Silphium most likely belonged to the genus Ferula, the same family as giant fennel and asafoetida. The botanical identification has been argued by scholars for centuries and remains technically unresolved, because we have no surviving specimen to study. What we do have is a remarkable physical record carved into the city of Cyrene's coinage. The Cyrenean silver tetradrachm shows the Silphium plant rendered in precise botanical detail. The segmented stalk, the umbel of small flowers at its crown, and most distinctively a heart-shaped seed pod at its base. That seed pod is one of the most recognizable images in ancient numismatics. It is also, almost certainly, the origin of the modern heart shape we associate today with love and Valentine's Day. The plant is gone. The symbol it produced is everywhere. The Cyrenaeans called Silphium the gift of Apollo. Hippocrates referenced it directly in his medical writings. Theophrastus, the philosopher who is often credited as the founder of botany as a discipline, wrote about it with technical precision in the 3rd century BC. Dioscorides, whose Materia Medica became the foundational pharmacological text of European medicine for 15 centuries, described it as effective for an extraordinary range of conditions. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist whose encyclopedic work shaped European understanding of the natural world for over 1,000 years, wrote about Silphium with the kind of grief usually reserved for the loss of empires. By Pliny's time in the 1st century AD, only a single stalk of Silphium had reportedly been found in the wild. According to Pliny, it was sent directly to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity. Hold that detail, we will come back to it. Because the fact that the last known specimen of the most medically significant plant in the ancient world was sent to a Roman emperor rather than to a physician, a botanical garden, a library, or any kind of preservation effort is one of the most telling details in the entire historical record. What did Silphium actually do? The ancient writers were specific, not vague, not poetic, not given to mystical exaggeration. They described Silphium with the technical precision of practitioners who had used the plant clinically for generations. The juice extracted from its stalk, called laser or laserpicium, was prescribed for fevers, sore throats, coughs, digestive complaints, skin conditions, menstrual irregularities, dog bites, and scorpion stings. It was used as a contraceptive, a function modern researchers have argued may have contributed to its overharvesting, since the demand for fertility regulation in the ancient world was as relentless as it is now. It was used in cooking, both as a flavouring and apparently for its digestive properties. It was traded across the entire Mediterranean basin at prices that made it, by weight, more valuable than silver. And then, within a historically compressed window, the references stop. Not gradually. Not through a slow, scholarly debate about declining efficacy. The references simply end. This is where the official story begins to feel insufficient. The agreed-upon explanation for Silphium's extinction involves overgrazing of the Cyrenaican plateau by Roman herding practices, climate shifts that reduced the plant's already narrow habitat, and unsustainable harvesting driven by commercial demand. All three of these factors were probably real. None of them adequately explains why no preserved cultivation effort survived. The Romans were not careless agricultural administrators. They moved valuable plant species across their empire as a matter of routine. They transplanted grapevines, olives, fruit trees, and medicinal herbs across thousands of miles, acclimatized them to new climates, and maintained estates that produced the same crops across multiple generations. They had every commercial motive to preserve Silphium. They had every technical capability, and yet the plant, alone among the major economic crops of the ancient Mediterranean, was permitted to die. That single anomaly is what opens up everything else. Because once you start looking at how completely Silphium was lost, the loss begins to look less like an accident and more like a removal. The plant itself disappeared. The seeds were not preserved in any garden, library, or apothecary collection. The cultivation methods were never documented in a form that survived. The compound formulations that combined laser resin with other ingredients to produce specific therapeutic effects were never recorded with the precision needed to reproduce them. The clinical knowledge fragmented and then evaporated, and critically, the same fate did not befall every other economically valuable plant in the Roman world. Olives were preserved, grapes were preserved, wheat varieties were preserved, hundreds of medicinal herbs of lesser value than Silphium were preserved in Dioscorides and the Arabic medical traditions that followed. Silphium alone vanished completely. I want to introduce a broader pattern at this point, and I want to be careful about the framing. Silphium is not the only example in the ancient world of a powerful medicinal substance that disappeared in ways the historical record cannot fully account for. Theriac was the great compound antidote of antiquity, a multi-ingredient preparation used by Roman emperors and prescribed for poisoning, plague, and a wide range of other afflictions. Recipes for theriac varied so dramatically between sources that historians today cannot reconstruct a single definitive version. The compound became more legend than medicine over the centuries that followed the classical period. Soma was the sacred healing and consciousness-altering plant of the Vedic tradition, referenced repeatedly throughout the Rig Veda as a substance of supreme medical and spiritual significance. Its botanical identity is now one of the most contested questions in the history of pharmacology. Dozens of candidates have been proposed, none has been definitively confirmed. The original knowledge appears to have evaporated from a civilization that documented almost everything else with remarkable care. Kyphi was the Egyptian sacred compound burned in temples and used therapeutically. Its preparation involved dozens of ingredients, careful ritual timing, and specialized knowledge held by a priestly class. Modern scholars have reproduced versions of it from surviving ingredient lists, but the functional preparation method, the specific ratios, the order of compounding, the cultural context that gave the substance its therapeutic meaning, was lost when the Egyptian temple traditions were dismantled. I cannot tell you with certainty that these losses are connected. What I can tell you is that the same pattern repeats. A valuable plant or compound with broad therapeutic applications, documentation by credible authorities, widespread use across a civilization, and then, within a historically compressed window, the substance disappears, the documentation becomes fragmentary, the knowledge of preparation is lost, and the medical tradition that relied on it is either absorbed into a more centralized system or simply abandoned. Whether this is coincidence stretched across multiple civilizations or something else is a question I will leave with you. What I will say is that the same pattern, in the same direction, expressed across different cultures and different time periods, is a great deal of coincidence to swallow. Let us return to Cyrene specifically, because the political timeline of how the Silphium-producing region came under Roman control is its own kind of evidence. The kingdom of Cyrene was bequeathed to Rome in 96 BC, according to the official record. The last Ptolemaic ruler of the region simply left his kingdom to Rome in his will. No war, no conquest, no prolonged negotiation, a document, a death, a transfer of sovereignty. I am not suggesting the will was forged. I am asking you to notice that the most economically valuable territory in the ancient Mediterranean, the territory that controlled the only known source of the most medically significant plant in the classical world, passed into Roman hands without resistance through a piece of paper. That is convenient. Whether it is suspiciously convenient or simply the way ancient succession sometimes worked is a question I will leave open. By the time Rome had fully absorbed Cyrene, the Silphium trade was already in decline. Within roughly a century of Roman political control, the plant was gone. The Romans had every motive to preserve Silphium. They were not careless, they were not naive, they were administering a sophisticated empire that depended on the controlled movement of goods, people and knowledge across enormous distances. The deliberate failure to preserve the most economically valuable medicinal crop in their newly acquired territory is not the behaviour of a competent agricultural administration. It is the behaviour of an administration that, for whatever reason, did not consider the preservation of this particular plant a priority, or, more troublingly, considered the disappearance of the plant a desirable outcome for reasons that were never recorded. This is the part of the story that becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss. Imagine what it would take to remove not just a plant but the knowledge of how to use a plant. The seeds, yes. The cultivation methods, yes. But also the preparation techniques, the dosage specifics, the compound formulations that combined Silphium's resin with other ingredients to produce targeted therapeutic effects. That knowledge did not live in one place. It lived in Alexandria, in Rome, in Athens, in Carthage, in the trading ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, in the personal notebooks of travelling physicians, in the working manuals of apothecaries across a vast and interconnected ancient world. For all of that knowledge to vanish as completely as it did would require a coordination so extraordinary, so simultaneous, and so comprehensive that it becomes very difficult to explain through accident or simple neglect. Every botanical garden, every medical school, every travelling physician's personal notes, every apothecary's handbook, every monastic library that preserved classical texts through the medieval period, every translation effort that carried Greek and Roman knowledge into Arabic and then back into Latin during the Renaissance. All of these would need to have, at essentially the same moment, either lost or chosen not to preserve the functional therapeutic knowledge of this one plant. That is not negligence. That is a wall that appears, by remarkable coincidence, exactly where the most useful knowledge should have been recorded. What survived is also instructive. The name survived. The reverence survived. The cultural memory of Silphium's importance survived clearly enough that Pliny could mourn it, that medieval scholars could reference the ancient testimonials, that we today can reconstruct a surprisingly detailed list of what the plant supposedly did. What did not survive was the how, the preparation methods, the compound formulations, the clinical specifics. The use was preserved, the utility was erased. That is a very specific and very unusual kind of forgetting. Civilizations that lose practical knowledge do not usually retain the cultural memory of the lost knowledge so vividly. The combination, vivid memory, complete practical loss, is what makes Silphium unusual. I want to move now into territory that is more speculative, and I will be explicit about that as we go. The tradition of herbal and compound medicine that Silphium represented did not simply vanish with the plant, it was transformed. What had been a broadly accessible trade-based system of botanical medicine, where the healing substance was a physical plant available to merchants, physicians, and ordinary citizens across the Mediterranean, became, over the subsequent centuries, something increasingly esoteric, increasingly fragmented, and increasingly dependent on specialized, restricted knowledge. The alchemical tradition that emerged in Alexandria in the early centuries of the Common Era is a fascinating case study in this transformation. Alchemists were scholars attempting to recover, reconstruct, and theorize about natural transformation processes, including medicinal processes, often working from incomplete, encoded, or deliberately obscured source materials. The great alchemical texts are filled with the language of loss, recovered knowledge, hidden teachings, encrypted wisdom from a prior age. Why would knowledge need to be hidden? What were the alchemists encoding, and from whom? The Arabic alchemical tradition that followed, and which preserved enormous quantities of Greek medical and philosophical knowledge that would otherwise have vanished entirely, similarly speaks in the language of transmission, recovery, and hidden lineage. Ibn Sina, Jabir ibn Hayyan. These were not charlatans or mystics. They were serious scholars conducting empirical natural research, and they worked consistently from the conviction that something significant had been lost, and that they were trying to reconstruct it. The pattern across the alchemical traditions is the pattern of people working backward from a sense of loss, trying to recover something that had been deliberately concealed by those who came before them. That is not the pattern of a civilization that simply forgot. That is the pattern of a civilization that knew something had been taken from it. The evidence suggests something larger was at stake than the loss of one plant. It suggests the disappearance of an entire way of approaching the natural world as a source of healing, a way that was comprehensive, integrated, and most importantly, decentralised. Silphium was not controlled by any single authority. The plant grew in Cyrene, but the knowledge of how to use it, prepare it, and combine it with other substances was distributed across the entire Mediterranean. Any merchant could trade in it, any physician could prescribe it, any apothecary could compound it, any educated patient could read about it in Theophrastus or Dioscorides and understand in broad terms what the plant was for. That kind of decentralised access is the opposite of the medical world we inherited. The world we inherited is centralised, credentialed, restricted and proprietary. And the question worth asking is whether that shift was incidental, or whether the disappearance of decentralised botanical medicine represented by Silphium was, at some level, a precondition for the rise of the controlled medical economy that replaced it. I want to be careful not to overstate this. I'm not arguing that there was a single hand directing the loss of Silphium and the consolidation of medical authority. The historical record does not support that level of claim. What I am arguing is that the pattern, taken as a whole, points in a particular direction. Decentralised systems of botanical knowledge, with their accessibility and their resistance to control, were lost across the same window of history in which centralised medical authority emerged. The two trends are not unrelated. Whether they are causally connected, and if so in what direction, is a question that deserves more serious investigation than the official histories have given it. Let me return one final time to the silver tetradrachm of Cyrene. On one face, the portrait of the ruling figure, the symbol of political authority. On the other face, the Silphium plant, rendered in precise botanical detail, the heart-shaped seed pod at its crown. For the Cyrenaeans, these two images were equivalent: sovereignty and medicine, political power and healing power, the two faces of a single coin, literally and philosophically. When Rome absorbed Cyrene, the Silphium coins gradually disappeared from circulation. New coins replaced them, Roman coins carrying Roman authority, Roman iconography, Roman symbols of imperial power. The plant was replaced by the portrait, the healing was absorbed by the state, and the coin itself, that ancient emblem of the equivalence between political sovereignty and medical sovereignty, became, like the plant, an object for collectors, a relic, a curiosity sent to emperors, a beautiful, useless artifact from a world that no longer existed. I do not know what Silphium could have done. None of us do. The biochemistry is gone, the clinical record is gone, the plant itself is gone. But I know that something extraordinary existed, something the ancient world, for all its limitations, recognized as extraordinary. They put it on their money. They wrote about it in their most important medical texts. They mourned its loss with genuine anguish. I know that the loss was unusually complete. I know that the knowledge of its use vanished with a thoroughness that exceeds what we would expect from simple neglect or natural extinction. And I know that the pattern, the template of valuable healing knowledge disappearing in exactly the ways most useful to those who would prefer healing to be controlled, restricted and centralised, is not unique to Silphium. It appears across multiple civilizations. It appears across multiple centuries. It always points in the same direction. So here is the question I leave you with. Not an accusation, not a conclusion, a question. What if the most important things that were lost from the ancient world, not the buildings, not the art, not the philosophy and history we have spent 2,000 years trying to recover, what if the most important losses were the practical ones, the knowledge of how to heal, the knowledge of how to use the natural world to keep human beings alive? What if those losses were not collateral damage of time and chaos? What if they were the point? What would we look like as a civilization if the decentralized botanical medicine of the ancient world had survived into the present? How would we look different from how we look now? And here is the question I find most difficult to set aside, the one I keep returning to in the quiet, after all the research is closed and the documents are stacked, and the anomalies are noted and nothing is resolved. If someone were to find Silphium tomorrow, growing somewhere in the hills above the Libyan coast, surviving against every odd in some sheltered valley where the goats never reach, would we know what to do with it? Or would that knowledge too be gone?